Hey everybody, how's it going? So, it's been a good minute since I've done one of these. I apologize in advance for the bad lighting. I'm not a professional YouTuber, as you've obviously seen with these videos. Never claimed to be, never will claim to be, and it is what it is. I just do this stuff for the love of it and really just to express myself. And that's what today's video is going to be about, mainly an expression. Um, Found some news out in the last couple days that as you've seen with some of these videos, you find out about unfortunate passings of heavy metal legends and people that influenced you, and you can't help but be shook up a little bit about it. So, I think it was reported that on January 2nd, I believe it was, that reportedly Sebastian Marino, former Overkill guitarist, had passed away at the age of 57. I found out about it yesterday morning on the 6th. Today's January 7th as I'm recording this. So, January 6th, 2023. I found out about it yesterday. I've had a little bit of time to digest it. Hadn't really thought way too much about it. I had a couple of, engagements with friends and such, and just work, I should say. A couple engagements with friends, with work. So wasn't really able to make this video sooner than now, but while I was kind of sitting doing a couple things today on my computer, just decided I'd go ahead and record this one and just give thoughts off the top of my head. So I'll do the best I can. Here we go. The reason why this one hits me kind of hard is, I go back a lot of times in these videos and I like to talk about basically just, the influence that these guys had on my playing, and also just even in life in general, just, as a music fan, guitar player, all of that. Just I like to talk about the influence that these people have had on me and just really I think what their contributions to heavy metal did for me as well, just again as a fan over the years and really as somebody who I think is never going to stop loving this music in some form or fashion. So, I think the most proper way, basically, to think about this or to tell the story, I should say, is to basically just first start off with how I first got into Overkill. It was back right around this time in 2006. Was getting into a lot of bands at the time, and Overkill was certainly one of the most notable ones. I had a friend of mine. This was back in the LimeWire days. Kind of dating myself a little bit here, but back in the LimeWire days, I remember. I think I'd read about Overkill or something like that, and was interested in finding other bands, from the just the legacy of thrash metal from the late '80s. So I think I had read about Overkill or had seen some recommendations of their music online on different forums and stuff like that. But I remember I was sitting at my parents' house when I was still a teenager. I would have been 16 at the time, and I remember hearing what I thought was Metallica's Master Puppets playing on. I think at the time it was VH1's Metal Mania, I believe, on VH1 Classic, and I heard it playing in the other room. I think I was napping on my mom's couch at or on my parents' couch at like 9 or 10 o'clock at night or something like that. And I hear what I believe is Metallica's Master Puppets being played really loudly. I still to this day have no idea why my mother had the TV on so loud in the other room, but I heard this playing, so I knew it was Metal Mania that she was watching. And the TV that I had in the living room or where I was, the TV in the living room, I turned it as fast as I could to VH1 Classic to get on Metal Mania, and it wasn't Metallica. It was, as I found out later, it was Overkill and the song Elimination. And the first two things I could think hearing this song, again, first time I've ever heard Overkill at this point, first two things I could think was number one, this singer sounds terrible. And number two, these guitar solos are pretty incredible. There was four of them in the song, and the guitar player on that early stuff for Overkill was Bobby Gustafson, obviously a legendary figure in his own right. Bobby G, obviously, his nickname, as many longtime fans will know him as. Um, I'll talk about him probably more at length, I'm sure, in a future video. A very influential player for me, just, in his own right, with his playing on the first several Overkill albums. But where this gets to Sebastian Marino, I mentioned the LimeWire days a few minutes ago. So I remember telling one of my friends at school, Tim was his name, and I remember telling Tim basically about, the stuff with that I was hearing, like the Elimination video, all of that, and just how intriguing I found it. I think the four guitar solos, I'd never heard a song like that had four different guitar solos in it, so it certainly caught my ear big time. I'd only been playing, I think it's roughly a year and a half at that point, so still very much in that raw embryonic stage, so to speak, where you're still kind of, absorbing like different bands, different songs, all of that, and in some ways still kind of drawing out your identity, I guess, as a musician and a music fan in general. So I was telling Tim about what I had heard and that I was interested in hearing more, and that I'd read like that the two big albums that a lot of people always pointed to were the Years of Decay and Horoscope. And I remember he actually downloaded a selection of some of the songs from both of those albums, and he burned them on a CD for me. and he had grabbed those off of LimeWire. So again, that's why I wanted to mention the LimeWire days. I don't even know if that service still exists to this day. So just again, probably dating myself there a little bit. But that being said, listened to those songs, thought it was great. Got over the voice thing very quickly. Actually, Bobby Blitz is one of my favorite vocalists nowadays, so I find it funny that my initial thoughts about him weren't so positive, so to speak. But nowadays I like Bobby's voice quite a bit. But I remember I was interested in hearing about or in listening to Overkill's albums that came after Horoscope, and one of the first ones that I was turned on to was the album From the Underground and Below, and still to this day one of my favorite Overkill albums. And guitar player wise, it featured Joe Comeau, who later went on to Annihilator. Actually, how I found out about Annihilator, that will be another one that'll be kind of a story in and of itself in another video. But Joe Comeau was on guitar, and then Sebastian Marino was also on guitar. So these two basically, splitting solo duties, two lead guitarists in the band. After Bobby G had left the band in 1990, Bobby Blitz and Dee Dee Verney, they basically wanted to have two guitar players, basically for the idea that they could never be compared to what they had before, and that way it would kind of just, I think, always keep that fresh vibe, so to speak, but keep a certain, I don't know, I guess just a certain level of differentiation from what they used to do, which I think in retrospect was I'd say it was a pretty wise move for the most part. Um, they'd had two different guitar players before Joe Comeau and before Sebastian Marino. It was Merritt Gant and Rob Canavino, who played on the next three albums after Bobby G, and then Joe and Sebastian came in after that. So From the Underground and Below was the second album that Joe and Sebastian were the guitar team of Overkill, and really, I think they pretty much nailed their sound. Maybe not exactly out of the gate, but I think on that second album, they absolutely nailed their sound as a guitar duo. It was the first time that Overkill was playing a majority of their songs not in E standard tuning. So I'm not going to call it experimental, but definitely a little bit different for the band. Just going for something a little bit different, and I think going for just a certain thickness and a certain heaviness. And really, honestly, to this day, some people may disagree with me on this, but I think to this day, Overkill's From the Underground and Below is still the band's heaviest album. Mixed by Colin Richardson, who at this point is well known as one of the founding fathers, so to speak, of modern metal mixes, all of that sort of stuff. The playing on the album, it's fascinating because, again, I've been kind of thinking about just Sebastian in general for the most part for the last little while, but the playing on the album is not anything necessarily groundbreaking per se. From the Underground and Below was released in 1997. So if you consider where thrash metal was, where groove metal was, industrial metal, because basically that album From the Underground and Below, it touches basically on those three genres more or less. If you think about where those genres were, guitar playing wise, it had already been done. You had a million different shredders. You had the rhythm masters like James Hetfield, Scotty, and Jeff Waters, the ones I always talk about in all these videos. It was interesting though that just thinking back on all that, I think what Joe and Sebastian brought to the band, I know that they were not really involved in primary songwriting duties at the time, but I think what they brought to the band was just I think Bobby Blitz once described it as, you get blood in here that wants to be here, and that basically from that standpoint, the band is no longer about the individual, it's about the band. And which I always thought was just the greatest thing. Obviously, it's like these guys take what they do very, very seriously. It's all about the band, no matter who's in the band at that point. So my thought always was that those mid to late '90s groove metal years for Overkill, I always thought that that was one of the most authentic and really most important periods of the band. I'm kind of, and again, anybody who watches these videos knows that basically I do these kind of off the top of my head. So apologies for no real organization, but I'll talk about From the Underground and Below again more here in a second, but just kind of like my little street cred, so to speak. I don't really share these things too much on the videos, but that was the first one, The Killing Kind, 1996. I never did find unfortunately, never found a CD copy of From the Underground and Below on CD. Hopeful maybe I can track one down on eBay at some point, but got a digital copy, still listen to it, still love it. The final one that Joe and Sebastian were on for Overkill was Necroshine, 1999. So my favorite out of the bunch again, From the Underground and Below, but I think all three albums basically, those two, Joe and Sebastian were on, I think all three of them just absolutely excellent. Some of the best releases in the Overkill discography. Going to Sebastian specifically, because the thing is with these guitar players, I listen to them, you get familiar with their style, and then if you like them, you want to know more about basically, how did they get to that level? How did they achieve that level of mastery, so to speak? And I remember reading that Sebastian Marino was actually a schooled guitar player. And when I say schooled, actually went to one of the legitimate musician academies for guitar players. I want to say it was Guitar Institute of Technology. I don't know that for a fact. I apologize. Should have fact checked beforehand. I didn't do it. Um, I always could tell though that just listening to Sebastian's playing on those three Overkill albums, and also an earlier one he appeared on, 1991's Anvil Worth the Wait by the band Anvil, you could hear in Sebastian's playing that there was definitely a certain level of organization and a certain level of, I guess, preparedness, thought outness, whatever you want to call it. You could tell with Sebastian's playing that he was a schooled player and that he had been basically trained more or less and had, basically acquired, whatever you want to call it, I guess, firsthand musical knowledge, from an academy, so on and so forth. You've had a million different players over the years that they didn't go the academy route and they turned out just fine. But just Sebastian Marino, like I said, you could just tell there was a certain something in his playing where it's like, this is pretty well thought out. I like this. Um, Great technique wise too. And that's the only, I think that's the only unfortunate thing about Overkill, at least from the mid '90s. Unless you were to unearth some interviews from the band members and whatnot, there's no real consensus on who played most of the rhythms on the three albums. Did they split up the duties? Did Joe do most of the rhythms? Did Sebastian do most of the rhythms? Just not a consensus there, unfortunately. But from what I've seen, obviously, with the live videos of the band when Joe and Sebastian were around, you would almost say from a rhythm standpoint that both players pretty much equal, I think, which that's pretty rare, really, when you think about it for two players in a band together. Very, very rare to find two players that are that equal as far as rhythm playing is concerned. Sebastian, I think, had the most memorable solos with Overkill, but Joe was a great lead guitarist in his own right. Sebastian had a couple in particular, though, that really always caught my ear. On From the Underground and Below, there's a ballad called Promises, which maybe wasn't the most popular song in the band's discography, but the guitar solo, one of the absolute best in the band's discography, and that was all Sebastian on that one. Similarly, on 1996's The Killing Kind, there was a song, The Morning After Private Bleeding, which also has a solo on it, by Sebastian. And the song, of course, like I said, similarly, it's a ballad. Not very, how am I trying to say this? It's not primarily driven by piano, but definitely piano, a good little bit of what pushes the song forward, and definitely different for Overkill. But the guitar solo does not disappoint whatsoever. And again, you could just tell it's like it's school. There's theory behind it. There's real thought put into it, and at the end of the day, just an excellent result, I thought. Some of the other solos in the band's heavier songs from this time period, they were good too. I think of like the lead trade-offs between Joe and Sebastian on the song Godlike from The Killing Kind. Sebastian solo from the song Revelation from Necroshine, that one certainly comes to mind. Or at least the ending portion anyway, because Joe and Sebastian trade off leads on that one. What I'm getting at basically ultimately, Sebastian, he's passed away as of a couple days ago, 57 years old, and well, he would never achieve obviously the notoriety of so many other players. I just thought it was important to talk about because, those early albums, at least for me, I'm going to call them early albums. Those albums, early ones in my listening years or my, the raw embryonic stages of my guitar playing, that was some of the most important stuff I'd ever heard. And even though I don't listen to it as much nowadays, it's still some of the most important stuff I'd ever heard. I was listening to the song "It Lives" off From the Underground and Below earlier this morning, and I think the sign of some of the best music you'll ever hear in your life is, let's say that you listen to a song years later, because right now, 2023, it's basically 16 years after I would have first heard, or actually, maybe I'm sorry, my math is wrong. 17 years basically after I first heard From the Underground and Below. That album at this point, it's going to turn 30 here in a couple of years, which is pretty crazy to consider. But I think the sign of some of the best songs and the best music you can ever listen to, when you listen to it again so many years later, again, 15 plus for me, does it give you that feeling of when you first heard it or just, that period of time when you were listening to it the most? For me, 100%, absolutely yes. And I think another way to think about it, just, I remember a friend years ago, he kind of, I guess, chastised me a little bit. And I think it was obviously joking. I don't think it was meant to be anything like serious or derogatory or whatever. But I remember a friend of mine, he's a little bit older, probably about 15 years older than me, something like that. Um, he never understood why I wasn't really into Black Sabbath and Dio and stuff like that. And, it was never a disrespect thing or anything like that. It's just, it's a different perspective when, you're a teenager in the mid 2000s, and things like Black Sabbath, Dio, and all that, well, so important, and still very popular, certainly in its own right. Not necessarily on the forefront of heavy metal anymore. And again, as a 15-year-old kid, when you're starting out with Anthrax and Metallica. This is stuff I first heard when I was like 3 years old. It sets like a certain benchmark, I guess, of just what you're listening to and basically just what sounds right in your ear. You could think about it from another standpoint that yes, I was listening to heavy metal basically via my parents at age 3 and 4, and it becomes that reference point. Maybe that's what I'm trying to say is the reference point. Think about like if you're somebody who listens to pop music at a really young age, again, say if your mom or dad are into that, if you listen to pop music or whatever, or Latin-based music, jazz, or anything like that, that's always going to be your reference point because you hear that as a youngster, and that's pretty much what's going to sound correct to your ear. And that's why I think to this day, for me, heavy metal is still that. Where I'm going though, like with the Sabbaths, the Dios, and all of that, is that you think about their guitar players: Tony Iommi, Richie Blackmore, the list goes on and on. Randy Rhoads, of Ozzy Osbourne fame, all of that sort of stuff. I look back on it, and it's the people like the Jeff Waterses, the Joe Commos, Scotty, and James Hetfield, Sebastian Marino that I just mentioned. Again, the main one this video is about. Those people to me were like they were and still are basically my Tony Iommi, my Richie Blackmore, so on and so forth. I just really can't. I can't really put it into any other perspective than that. So it's just again unfortunate with Sebastian. 57 years old, and I know he had been out of the music scene at least as in a performing capacity. He had been out of the music scene for quite some time. I believe was still based in Rochester, New York. Because he was an upstate New Yorker. I want to say he was still based in Rochester, New York, and was running a sound company and relatively successful at it, from what I understand. And all the things I've read on the internet in the days since Sebastian's passing, nothing but positive vibes. And I think that says an awful lot about the person. I've had some thoughts over the years of, if I could do like some sort of a guitar based YouTube channel or something like that, and if I would have been able to maybe contact people from the past and, do like these interviews and such with, some players who maybe weren't in the limelight anymore, just to get some more information about the albums and, just what parts maybe did they play specifically, like at least as far as rhythms, all of that, who maybe came up with what, were there changes to songs in the studio, just a litany of different questions that you could ask. And Sebastian Marino was certainly one that was kind of on that short list. I've got maybe about 10 or 15 people that I would hope someday, if I was ever lucky enough, that maybe I could interview them and just again really look at things from a guitar perspective and just I guess really just dissect like the playing of like stuff that they had done years earlier and that just maybe had been sort of forgotten about, so to speak. Um, and I feel some regret that I'm not going to be able to get to do that chance with Sebastian Marino. It's disappointing, obviously, just him passing in general, and it's disappointing, just from the standpoint of not being able to do the possibly potentially do the interview had he been open to it. Obviously, I never knew him or anything like that, so I'm not going to be big headed about it because I'm sure it's I'm sure it's a strange thing, obviously, for people maybe that have been out of the limelight to just get a random email or something like that from somebody who's just a fan or whatever and wanting to do an interview. I mean, I understand obviously if the answer would have been no, it wouldn't have been a big deal certainly, but most of all though, it's just disappointing from that fan's perspective because again, I know that Sebastian Marino, Joe Comeau, and Overkill, I know that they weren't like the absolute beginning for me, but when I think back just on those old days, just as a fan, and again, just being a young guitarist, learning, trying to absorb all of it, basically take as many lessons as I could from all of it. People like Sebastian Marino, they were the ones I looked up to, and to this day, still the ones that I look up to. He may have only been an Overkill for 3 albums, and I think it would have been roughly about 3.5 years he was in the band, but an awful lot of noise for the 3 albums and for the 3.5 years. I know a lot of people who have talked about just seeing Overkill in that time period live said that they were a force to be reckoned with back then. So obviously the live show is absolutely excellent. There's some clips, of course, on the Overkill DVD wrecking everything, and I think there's a couple with Joe and Sebastian from that period of the band where they were playing, and absolutely dynamite. I wish I could have seen that era of the band because still to this day, despite the fact that albums like The Years of Decay, Horoscope, some of the other ones, I know they've put out some ones in recent years that were really good. White Devil Armory is one certainly. Um, there's a lot of those early and later albums and eras, I guess I'll say. A lot of that early and later stuff is looked at as some of the best, or arguably the best in Overkill's history. I really feel like, though, deep down for me, that mid 90s or mid to late 90s groove metal era of Overkill is my favorite era of the band, and one that I still hold in extremely, extremely high regard, even if I don't listen to the albums all that often anymore. And honestly, that's not even just an Overkill thing. I guess it's just hard for me to sit down and listen to full albums nowadays because you spend so much time doing that as a youth that you absorb the stuff extremely greatly, and it never leaves you. Obviously, it's always there. If you're somebody who's a diehard and committed to it, it never leaves you entirely. So even though I don't really listen to the stuff as much nowadays, I'm still playing the guitar practically every day. Obviously playing in that style practically every day. It never leaves you. Um, and I think that's basically my way of saying thank you to Sebastian Marino and the rest of the members of Overkill for that matter, but specifically to Sebastian Marino. Um, I say it a lot of times, just the contributions and just heavy metal to Overkill, certainly in my life. It's I've been doing better this last little while, just personally. I know sometimes on these videos, you can kind of tell that I sometimes maybe am not feeling so well. I've certainly been better the last little while. Kind of feel like I'm coming out of coming out of what was a bad period of my life, for a good extended period of time there, and things have been pretty good for the last little while, and just feeling a little bit more of an era of, or what's it, an aura of positivity. I'm sorry, I'm getting my words all crossed up here. Feeling a bit more of an aura of positivity, so to speak, but I think pretty deeply about a lot of things, and I think pretty deeply about just my life in general. Um, and I think about obviously the best days of my life. And some of the best days of my life were, as that 15, 16-year-old kid just in his bedroom playing guitar and listening to those albums. And again, specifically, a lot of times those three albums from Overkill from the mid to late 90s. And just you think about, I mean, for me, that stuff was so, so important because I mentioned earlier that I found Annihilator through Joe Comeau because, obviously I love Joe a lot too. Finding out he sang with Annihilator, a few years after that, I think it was 2001 specifically, he started singing for Annihilator. Did that for a little while, and I became a huge, huge Annihilator fan just through that discovery, so to speak, of knowing what Joe went on to later. Annihilator opened up the door to so much other stuff that I ended up listening to. But it's funny because all these years later, you get into stuff like Obituary, Death, Testament, foul guitar players like Chuck Schuldiner, James Murphy, Chris Broderick, the list goes on and on. Jeff Loomis, Alexi Leho. You follow all these players and love what they do, but at the end of the day, a lot of times I just come right back to where I began. It's kind of a full circle thing. I'll be getting near the closing point. I love telling stories, so I'm not going to apologize for it. But I remember just for example, like 2008, I think it was about mid 2008 through probably mid 2009. I went on kind of this journey, so to speak, of listening to almost nothing but death metal. And when I say death metal, like early 90s death metal, again, your Death, Obituary, a little bit of Cannibal Corpse, Morbid Angel, stuff like that. And good music. And I still respect it and appreciate it for what it is. Somewhere, though, along the way, mid 2009, it was a time of great change in my life. I was trying to lose a lot of weight and really just trying to find myself again after similarly what was a bad period of time for like the previous probably year and a half or so before that. And you rediscover the stuff like the Metallicas, the Anthraxes, and again those albums from Overkill. So kind of realized at that point in mid to late 2009, early 2010, I pretty much knew what my bread and butter was. You know, there was a reason I was into this music, thrash metal specifically. There was a reason I was into that music from the very, very get go. And even though I hadn't listened to it, regularly for quite some time at that point, it sunk its teeth into me again. And pretty much here we are, 2023, roughly almost 14 years later, and it just did never let go. Again, you never forget what your bread and butter is. So I know this video has been a little bit all over the place, and maybe I haven't talked about Sebastian Marino as much as maybe I should have. But again, just putting into perspective that people like him to me basically were like my Richie Blackmores and again Tony Iommi, all those names that they look at as like the metal gods from the beginning on guitar. That's what somebody like Sebastian Marino is to me. So again, just very very disappointed about his passing. 57, too young to go. You would have thought that he would have still had some time. I was happy to see that Anvil and Overkill both posted some tributes to Sebastian. And if nothing else, even though that those albums, again, from that mid to late 90s, even though that stuff is not nearly as popular as the other Overkill albums, if nothing else, Sebastian Marino's recorded legacy lives on. The albums will always be there. The songs will always be there. Overkill still performs some of that stuff live a little bit here and there. So, that legacy is going to be alive from that standpoint, too. Sebastian, I know you're not with us anymore. But it's one of those things where I just have to say thank you so much for your contributions. Thank you for the role that you played in my life. Just the music and really just giving me something greater to aspire to. I'll never be as good of player as you were. There's no way whatsoever. I'll never even be that close. That's okay. It's not a big deal. It's been an incredible journey in my life, just, trying to learn how to play all of this music. And thank you for giving me just a beacon of light to strive to and a goal to always have myself kind of pushing towards. Whether I make it or not is going to be up to me. Guitar playing and learning is a heck of a journey, a heck of a struggle sometimes, but I think it's worth the struggle. You get a lot of rewards out of it. So, again, thank you to Sebastian Marino. Your legacy will live on forever. Rest in peace, my friend.